Billionaire CEO panics without a Japanese translator until the black janitor takes over and welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The silence in Arthur Vance's office was the most expensive thing he owned. It was a cathedral of quiet, built on 70 floors of steel and ambition, insulated from the city's roar by panes of glass an inch thick. From this perch, the world was a distant, orderly abstraction, a flowchart of logistics and capital. Yet, the silence had begun to feel less like peace and more like a vacuum. It was the sound of a heart that had stopped beating. Arthur stood at the vast, floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection a ghost superimposed over the sprawling metropolis his father had conquered. He wore his father's title, sat in his father's chair, and felt the crushing weight of his father's legacy like a suit of armor he was slowly suffocating in. His father, the legendary titan of industry, had been a builder, a man who saw the world in blueprints and possibilities. Arthur, by contrast, was a caretaker, a manager of decline, a man who saw the world in quarterly reports and shrinking profit margins. The Vance Corporation, once a behemoth of American manufacturing and innovation, was now a lumbering giant, its joints stiff with bureaucracy, its spirit bled out by 1,000 cost-saving measures. They no longer created, they merely sustained. And lately, even that was in doubt. Their competitors, leaner and hungrier, were circling, their new technologies making Vance's time-tested methods look like relics from a bygone era. The silence was broken by the soft, almost imperceptible hiss of the office door. Elias Thorne entered without a word, his movements as quiet and practiced as a prayer. He was the night janitor, a man in his late 50s with a face carved by a sorrow Arthur couldn't name and a dignity that seemed out of place amidst the polished chrome and leather. Elias moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands calloused and sure, wiping down surfaces, emptying wastebaskets, restoring order to a world that felt, to Arthur, increasingly chaotic. He was a part of the building's unseen machinery, a ghost who polished the monuments of other men's success. Arthur never spoke to him, and Elias never offered a word. It was a silent, unspoken contract of their differing orbits. Yet, Arthur found himself watching the old man. He watched the way Elias's hands, though rough, moved with a surprising gentleness, the way his eyes, though often downcast, missed nothing. There was a stillness about him, a self-contained world of thought that Arthur, in his gilded cage, envied. This evening, the silence felt heavier than usual. Arthur had just come from a board meeting that had been less a meeting and more a slow, polite execution. Their flagship engine line, the one that had built the company, was obsolete. A rival had unveiled a new design, smaller, more efficient, and more powerful. Vance Corp had nothing to counter it. The board had given him an ultimatum: present a viable alternative in 1 month, or they would begin the process of a restructuring, a bloodless word for a corporate dismemberment. 1 month to save an empire. It was an impossible task. His R&D department, once a wellspring of innovation, was now a stagnant pond of risk-averse engineers who hadn't produced a truly new idea in a decade. He was adrift, the captain of a sinking ship with a mutinous crew and no land in sight. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice that Elias had finished his work and was leaving, his cart squeaking softly down the hall. Arthur turned from the window, the city lights a blur of indifferent stars, and felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled his knees. He walked out of his office, needing to move, to escape the suffocating quiet of his own failure. He wandered the empty, echoing corridors of the executive floor, a king in a deserted castle. He took the elevator down, not to the lobby, but to the lower levels, the building's guts. Here, the plush carpets gave way to polished concrete, the mahogany walls to painted cinderblock. This was the world where the real work happened, a world he rarely saw. He found himself in the deserted locker room for the maintenance staff. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and honest labor. And it was there that he saw it. A single locker, slightly ajar, a dim light spilling from within. It was Elias Thorne's. Arthur knew he shouldn't look. It was a violation of the man's privacy, a transgression. But he was drawn by an impulse he couldn't control. He pushed the locker door open. Inside, it was a world away from the mops and buckets on the janitor's cart. The space was a miniature workshop. Tacked to the inside of the door were not family photos, but complex schematics, hand-drawn blueprints of astonishing detail and elegance. They depicted an engine, but one unlike anything Arthur had ever seen. It was compact, its design revolutionary, its principles of thermodynamics laid out with a clarity and genius that made his breath catch in his throat. And on the shelf below, nestled amongst worn-work gloves and a thermos, was a small, partially assembled prototype. It was a marvel of miniature engineering, its components machined with a watchmaker's precision. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was, Arthur realized with a jolt that struck him like lightning, the answer. It was the future of his company. He stared at the contents of the locker, his mind reeling. Who was this man? This quiet, unassuming janitor who polished his floors and emptied his trash? Who was this ghost who haunted his halls, carrying in his heart and hands the very salvation Arthur had been so desperately seeking? He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cool metal of the prototype. In that moment, the silence of the building was broken by a new sound, the soft, steady beat of his own, returning hope. He closed the locker door gently, his mind racing. He had 1 month, and he had just found his miracle. Now, he had to convince the miracle worker to share it. The next evening, Arthur waited. He sat in his vast, silent office, the city lights painting patterns on the floor, and he waited for the sound of the janitor's cart. The hours crawled by, each tick of the grandfather clock in the corner a small, sharp blow against his composure. The prototype, the blueprints, they had haunted his sleep, a tantalizing vision of salvation that felt more like a dream than a reality. He had spent the day in a fugue state, going through the motions of his duties, his mind consumed by a single, burning question. Who was Elias Thorne? When the soft hiss of the door finally announced Elias's arrival, Arthur stood, his heart pounding. Elias entered, his movements as practiced and unobtrusive as always. He nodded once to Arthur, a gesture of silent acknowledgement, and began his work. Elias, Arthur said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. Elias paused, his hand hovering over the wastebasket. He turned slowly, his expression one of polite, professional inquiry. "Sir, please," Arthur said, gesturing to one of the plush leather chairs opposite his desk. "Sit down. I need to speak with you." Elias hesitated, a flicker of confusion in his calm eyes. A janitor did not sit in the CEO's guest chair. It was a violation of the unwritten laws that governed their separate worlds. But there was an intensity in Arthur's gaze, a raw urgency that compelled him. He moved to the chair and sat, his posture straight, his work-worn hands resting on his knees. He looked less like a janitor and more like a king in disguise, holding court in a foreign land. Arthur took a breath. "I was in a maintenance locker room last night," he began, deciding that directness was the only path. "Your locker was open. I saw the engine." Elias's face, which had been so placid, instantly hardened. A shudder came down over his eyes, his expression becoming guarded, impenetrable. His body tensed, the quiet dignity replaced by a fierce, protective stillness. "That is my private property," he said, his voice low and cold. "I know, and I apologize for the intrusion," Arthur said quickly. "But Elias, what I saw, it's brilliant. It's revolutionary. It's the most innovative piece of engineering I've seen in 20 years. Elias said nothing. His silence was a wall, and Arthur knew he had to find a way to breach it. "My company is in trouble," Arthur continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping, shedding the CEO's authority and taking on the raw edge of desperation. "We're on the verge of collapse. That design, it could save us. It could save everything my father built." The mention of his father seemed to strike a chord. A flicker of something, pain, memory, passed through Elias's eyes before the shutter came down again. "It is not for sale," he said, his voice flat and final. "I'm not asking to buy it," Arthur pressed. I'm asking, who are you? How could you create something like that? The schematics, the precision, that's the work of a genius. Elias looked away, his gaze fixed on the city lights beyond the window. For a long moment, he was silent, and Arthur feared he had lost him, that the old man would simply stand up and walk away, taking his secrets with him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with a grief that was ancient and raw. It wasn't my work, he said softly. It was my son's. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and heartbreaking. His name was Leo, Elias continued, his voice a near whisper. He was like your father, a builder, a prodigy. He saw the world in numbers and angles and light. He was studying engineering at the State University on a full scholarship. He was going to change the world. Elias paused, swallowing hard. This engine, this was his senior project, his masterpiece. We were building it together in the small workshop behind our house. It was his dream. What happened? Arthur asked gently, his own sense of failure paling in comparison to the profound loss he was now witnessing. A car accident, Elias said, his voice breaking on the last word. A drunk driver. He was gone in an instant. A light that bright just snuffed out. He fell silent again, lost in a memory that was clearly too painful to hold. After he died, he continued after a moment, I lost everything. The house, the workshop. I couldn't bear to be in it without him. The grief, it was a weight I couldn't carry. I sold it all, and I just walked away. I took this job because it was quiet, because no one asked questions, because I could be a ghost. The only thing I kept were his notebooks, his plans, and the prototype. I've been finishing it. Here, in the dark. It's the only thing I have left of him. It's the last conversation we'll ever have. Arthur was speechless. The story was a punch to the gut. This was not about a secret genius. It was about a father's love, about a promise to a dead son. He understood now the sanctity of what he had stumbled upon. He understood that he was not just asking for a blueprint. He was asking for a piece of a man's soul. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, standing beside Elias, the two of them looking out at the indifferent city. My father, Arthur said, his voice quiet, he was a brilliant man, a titan, but he was not a good father. He was distant, demanding. He saw me as his greatest project and his greatest disappointment. I have spent my entire life trying to live up to his shadow, and I have failed. This company, his legacy, it's dying in my hands. He turned to face Elias. I cannot imagine your grief, he said, his voice raw with sincerity. But I understand what it means to want to honor a legacy. Help me, Elias. Don't help me save my company. Help me finish your son's work. Let's show the world what he created. Let's build his dream, not in the dark of a locker, but in the light where everyone can see his genius. Let's give his legacy a voice. Elias looked at Arthur, really looked at him, and saw not a powerful CEO, but another grieving son, a man wrestling with his own ghosts. He saw the sincerity in Arthur's eyes, the desperate, honest plea. He looked at his own calloused hands, the hands that had held his son's first drawing, the hands that were now trying to finish his last masterpiece. The idea was terrifying, to bring his son's work, his private, sacred grief, into the light, into the cutthroat world of corporate industry. It felt like a betrayal. But then he thought of Leo, of his son's boundless, optimistic energy, of his desire to build things that would make the world better. Leo wouldn't have wanted his dream to die in the darkness of a locker. He would have wanted it to fly. Elias took a slow, deep breath, a breath that felt like it was his first in years. He stood up, his posture once again straight and strong. Where do we begin? He asked. The alliance between the CEO and the janitor was forged in the shared language of grief and a desperate, flickering hope. They did not work in the gleaming, sterile R&D labs on the upper floors. Instead, Elias led Arthur to a place deep in the belly of the Vance Corporation building, a place that had been forgotten by time and progress. It was an old pattern-making workshop from his father's era, a vast, cavernous room filled with silent, dust-shrouded lathes, drill presses, and milling machines. The air was thick with the scent of old oil, cold steel, and sawdust, a ghost perfume of creation. Your father gave me my first job in this room, Elias said, running a hand over a heavy, cast-iron workbench. I was just a boy, sweeping floors. But he saw something in me. He taught me how to read a blueprint, how to work a lathe. He said I had good hands. This small revelation struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. His father, the remote, demanding figure of his childhood, had been a mentor to this quiet, unassuming man. There were entire worlds within his own father's life that he knew nothing about. This workshop became their sanctuary, their secret forge. By day, Arthur was the embattled CEO, fending off the circling vultures of the board and the relentless pressure from his rival, Marcus Thorne. By night, he would shed his expensive suit, roll up his sleeves, and become Elias's apprentice. Under Elias's patient, expert guidance, Arthur learned the visceral, tactile language of manufacturing. He learned the feel of a perfectly balanced tool, the smell of hot metal, the satisfying bite of a drill into a block of steel. His hands, once soft and accustomed only to paper and pens, grew calloused and stained with grease. He was not just building an engine. He was rebuilding himself, connecting with his father's legacy not through a balance sheet, but through the honest, arduous work of creation. Elias, in turn, began to emerge from the shell of his grief. In the focused, purposeful work, he found a respite from his sorrow. Teaching Arthur, seeing the younger man's genuine respect and eagerness to learn, rekindled a part of him he thought had died with his son. He would speak of Leo, not with the raw pain of before, but with a quiet, loving pride. He would point to a specific gear ratio or a unique piston design and say, "This was Leo's idea." He said it would reduce friction by 12%. He was right. They worked in a comfortable, productive silence, punctuated by the hum of machinery and the quiet murmur of their collaboration. The bond that formed between them was deep and unspoken, a friendship built on mutual respect and a shared mission. Arthur saw in Elias the father he had always wanted, a patient teacher, a quiet source of wisdom and strength. Elias saw in Arthur the potential of his own son, the bright, capable young man, now burdened with a weight too heavy to carry alone. One night, as they were calibrating the fuel injection system, Arthur spoke of his rival. "His name is Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice tight. "He was my father's protege, in a way. He's brilliant, ruthless, and he believes he is the rightful heir to this company. He's been trying to force me out since the day my father died." "Men like that don't build," Elias said, his eyes fixed on his work. "They only take. They see a beautiful thing, and their only instinct is to own it or to break it. You have to be careful, Arthur. He will not play by the rules." Elias's words were prophetic. Thorne, sensing that something was amiss, that Arthur's desperation had been replaced by a new, quiet confidence, intensified his efforts. He had a network of informants within the company, employees loyal to him either through ambition or fear. One of them, a junior engineer in the R&D department, noticed the strange requisitions for raw materials, the odd power drains from the old workshop, and reported back to his master. Thorne knew something was happening. He couldn't get into the workshop. Elias had repurposed the old, heavy steel door and fitted it with a lock only he and Arthur could open, but he could attack from the outside. He began a campaign of corporate sabotage. He leaked false, damaging rumors to the financial press about Vance Corp's instability. He poached two of Arthur's key department heads with outrageous salary offers. He put pressure on their suppliers, causing critical delays in their other production lines. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, designed to bleed the company and distract Arthur, to force him to abandon whatever secret project he was working on. The pressure was immense. Arthur was stretched to his breaking point, spending his days in frantic damage control and his nights in the workshop. He grew tired, his face drawn, the circles under his eyes darkening. One night, he made a critical mistake, miscalculating a tolerance on a piece he was machining, ruining a vital, custom-made component. He swore, throwing the ruined piece across the room in a rare display of frustration. "It's hopeless," he said, slumping onto a stool, his head in his hands. "He's going to win. He's going to tear it all down, and there's nothing I can do." Elias walked over and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he pointed to the large, complex blueprint of the engine tacked to the wall. "Look at that, Arthur," he said softly. "Your rival. He sees a machine. He sees profits and patents. I see my son's heart. You see your father's legacy. We are not fighting for a company. We are fighting for something more. And that is a fight we cannot lose." He picked up the ruined component. "This is just steel," he said. "We can make another one. What we are building in here, what we are building in ourselves, that is the thing he can never touch." Arthur looked up at the old man, at the quiet, unshakable strength in his eyes, and felt his own resolve return, stronger than before. The bond between them had been tested, and it had held. They went back to work, the sound of their labor a defiant answer to the chaos Thorn was trying to create. They were no longer just a CEO and a janitor. They were partners, a two-man army fighting a silent war in the heart of the Empire, and they were beginning to believe they could actually win. The one-month deadline loomed like a guillotine. The board meeting was scheduled for a Friday, and as the date approached, the pressure in the old workshop became a palpable thing, as thick and charged as the air before a lightning strike. Marcus Thorn had escalated his corporate assault, launching a hostile takeover bid backed by a consortium of foreign investors. The move was audacious, a public declaration of war, and it sent the company's stock into a tailspin. The board was panicking. Arthur was inundated with frantic calls, his days a blur of crisis meetings and reassuring speeches to his demoralized employees. But every night, he would retreat to the sanctuary of the workshop, to the quiet focus of the work, and to the steady, calming presence of Elias Thorn. They worked with a feverish intensity, their movements a synchronized dance of creation. The engine was nearly complete. It sat on the central workbench, a compact, beautiful piece of machinery, its polished steel and brass components gleaming under the bare work lights. It was more than a machine. It was a sculpture, a testament to a boy's genius and a father's love. They needed only to finish the final assembly and run the first diagnostic test. Thorn knew he was running out of time. His takeover bid was contingent on VanceCorp's failure to produce a viable new technology. If Arthur and Elias succeeded, his entire strategy would collapse. He had to stop them. He couldn't get into the workshop, but he knew its weak point, its connection to the factory's main power grid. On the Wednesday night before the board meeting, Thorn made his move. He used a bribed night shift foreman to orchestrate a catastrophic power surge in the section of the factory that housed the old workshop. The lights in the workshop flickered, buzzed violently, and then went out, plunging them into absolute darkness. The whine of the machines died, and the emergency backup generator, old and long neglected, failed to kick in. A smell of fried electronics filled the air. They were dead in the water. "He cut the power," Arthur said, his voice flat and dead in the darkness. He knew we were close. For a moment, a profound and utter despair settled over them. They were so close, only to be thwarted by a simple, brutal act of sabotage. But Elias did not panic. He stood in the darkness, and Arthur could feel his calm, a solid, unshakable presence. "There's always a way, Arthur," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "My father used to have a secondary generator, a small gas-powered one, for his private lab. He never trusted the main grid completely. It's been sitting in the old storage cage for 30 years. If the parts haven't rusted through, we might be able to get it running." For the next hour, they worked by flashlight and lantern, a desperate, frantic race against time. They found the old generator, a relic covered in dust and cobwebs. Elias, with Arthur as his determined but clumsy assistant, began to dismantle it, his hands moving with an instinctual knowledge of its inner workings. He cleaned the spark plugs, cleared the fuel lines, and rewired the frayed connections. It was a painstaking, frustrating process. Parts were missing. Wires crumbled in their hands. The fuel in the tank had long since turned to varnish. At one point, Arthur, his hands bleeding from a slipped wrench, was ready to give up. "It's no use, Elias. It's over." "No," Elias said, his voice firm, his face grim with determination in the flickering lantern light. Leo never gave up on a problem. He would just look at it from a different angle. We're looking at this as a power problem. It's not. It's a fuel problem. He disappeared into the darkness of the factory and returned a few minutes later with a can of cleaning solvent and a length of copper tubing. What followed was a piece of pure, improvisational genius. Elias jury-rigged a new fuel line, using the solvent as a makeshift, highly volatile fuel. It was dangerous. It was unorthodox. It was their only chance. "Stand back," he said. He took a deep breath and pulled the starter cord. The generator sputtered, coughed, and then, with a deafening roar, it shuddered to life. A single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered, then burned with a steady, defiant glow. They had light. They had power. They had a chance. They worked through the rest of the night, and all through the next day, a two-man crew running on coffee, adrenaline, and sheer force of will. They completed the final assembly, their movements precise and economical, their exhaustion burned away by the urgency of their mission. As dawn broke on the morning of the board meeting, they were ready. They stood before the finished engine, their faces smudged with grease, their bodies aching, but their spirits unbroken. It was a moment of profound, quiet triumph. Arthur looked at the engine, then at Elias. "He would be so proud of you," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond gratitude. "No," Elias said, placing a hand on the engine's cool, metal housing. "He would be proud of us." The board meeting was held in the cavernous, intimidating main boardroom. The air was thick with tension and hostility. Marcus Thorne was already there, flanked by his lawyers, his face a mask of smug, predatory confidence. He thought he had already won. The board members, a collection of gray-faced, nervous men, sat at the long, polished table, avoiding Arthur's gaze. The meeting began. Thorne's lead lawyer made a long, damning speech about Arthur's failed leadership, the company's plummeting stock, and the urgent need for a change. He formally presented their takeover offer. It was a lowball price, an insult, but one the board, in its panic, was clearly considering. When it was Arthur's turn to speak, he did not walk to the podium. He stood at his place, his posture calm, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have heard a compelling story of failure. And it is true that this company has been failing. We have been failing to innovate, failing to take risks, failing to honor the legacy of the man who built this room." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that failure ends today." He pressed a button on the console before him. The large screen at the front of the room, which had been displaying a depressing stock chart, flickered to life. It showed a live feed from the old workshop. In the center of the room, on a testing rig, was the engine. Elias Thorne stood beside it, his hands resting on the control panel. He was no longer a janitor in a faded uniform. He was a master craftsman in his element, his face calm and authoritative. "For the past month," Arthur continued, his voice ringing with a newfound power, "we have been working on a project. A secret, a new beginning. What you are about to see is not just a new engine. It is the future of this company." He nodded to the screen. "Elias," he said, "if you would." In the workshop, Elias nodded back. He threw a switch. The engine turned over. It sounded low, powerful, and perfectly balanced hum. It was quieter, smoother, and, as the data began to stream across the screen, more powerful and efficient than anything in the industry. It was a masterpiece. The boardroom was silent. The board members stared at the screen, their faces a mixture of astonishment and dawning awe. Marcus Thorne's jaw had gone slack, the color draining from his face. He was staring at the impossible. "This engine," Arthur said, his voice now a quiet declaration of victory, "is the work of Elias Thorne and his late son, Leo. It is a design of pure genius, and it belongs to the Vance Corporation." The spell was broken. The room erupted. The board members were on their feet, their faces alight with excitement. The takeover offer was forgotten, a piece of irrelevant history. The future was humming on the screen before them. Thorne and his lawyers sat frozen, their empire of lies and intimidation crumbling around them. Arthur walked to the head of the table and looked at Thorne, not with triumph, but with a kind of pity. "The meeting is over, Marcus," he said quietly. "And so are you." The battle was won. The company was saved. And two grieving sons had, together, honored the legacies of their fathers and, in the process, had forged their own. The silence in the workshop that evening was one of deep, shared contentment. Arthur and Elias stood before the cooling engine, a monument to their strange, improbable partnership. The janitor and the CEO, the father who had lost a son, and the son who had never truly had a father. They had met in the wreckage of their separate griefs and had built something new, something beautiful, something that would last. The future of the company was secure, but more than that, the future of the two men who had saved it was, for the first time, bright with a clear and unwavering light.